right. Good morning, everyone. I think to be conscious of everyone's time, we are going to go ahead and get started this morning. My name is Rachel Nyman, and I'm with the Brandon Chamber of Commerce. And I would just like to thank everyone for taking time out of their morning to join us. And I'd like to thank our District 10 and 25 legislators for being here and sharing their time with us as well. We will start by letting everyone introduce themselves, and then we are going to play a video from Maggie Sutton. She was not able to be here with us this morning, but wanted to send a message. So we'll do that after introductions. So go ahead.
Well, good morning, and thank you for coming out, and a thank you to the Chamber for hosting this event. It's certainly appreciated. Typical South Dakota morning this morning, so good to see so many people make it out. I'm Doug Barthel. I represent District 10, which is northeast Sioux Falls and Brandon, of course, and then some of the surrounding area. This would be my fourth session that I've been in here, so things so far are getting busy. We're about halfway through the session, and looking forward to some more fun ahead, but so far it's been good to represent you. Appreciate it.
Good morning, and thanks again for the chamber hosting this. I appreciate that. Steve Haugaard, live over by Renner, representing Northeast Sioux Falls and Brandon. And that may be kind of the end of that as the redistricting goes on. I don't know how that's going to reshape things, but I would expect 25 especially would be addressed since it wraps around the east side of 10 here and goes all the way down to Southeast Sioux Falls. So redistricting will be important this year. But anyway, this I've been speaker for the past couple of years. This year I'm on appropriations and a couple other committees, but we're taking a close look at the budget. Obviously, we have some interesting aspects to that this year since we have this deluge of money that we're trying to spend. So look forward to questions. Thanks.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is John Hansen. I live in Del Rapids, and I represent District 25 in the House, along with Representative Pischke, who's feeling a little under the weather, so he couldn't be with us today. I'm honored this year to serve as Speaker Pro Tem of the House, and I also serve as the Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee and serve on the State Affairs Committee. So all that is to say, it's been a very busy session to this point. We've got so much going on, but so much good stuff going on for the state of South Dakota. So it's just good to be here and look forward to having a conversation with you and talking about the issues that are important to you.
Thank you and good morning. My name is Marcia Symens. I'm District 25, live in Dells, next to John, sort of, kind of, and Tom. So it's been kind of fun. I'm very, very new to all of this, and I appreciate your patience with me. But I am on the Senate Tax Committee and the Senate Transportation Committee, and I appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll get started with Margaret Sutton's message. Okay, wonderful. We are going to go ahead and get started and open it up to questions. And I have John here who's going to get us started.
Rachel, thanks for setting us up, and thanks to Dave and everybody at Tailgaters for the wonderful coffee. My question, one of the main reasons I came today is just in regards to the HJR 5001 and the committee on Monday, where it was voted down. And I'm learning what that means, I guess, but it doesn't sound like it's going to happen for a vote. But I heard something about it coming. Blake Curd proposed it on the Senate side. So I was just wondering if all of you could speak to that on your perspective on Convention of States, and what your position is and how you came to that position. So.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to limit it to roughly 3 minutes per legislator, just so we can get everyone's questions asked and just keep things moving. So go ahead.
All right, I'll start out. Convention of States I've supported over the years. I know the opposition argument is that you open up the Constitution as a free-for-all in a sense, and I don't see that as being accurate. In some sense, I see the issue as almost a coin toss. And it's going to take, a groundswell of support for this thing across the United States. And even if that happened, and there was the convention, and there was the limited change made, which is usually to address the budget and to require a balanced federal budget. If that happened, you still have to have it ratified by, I think it's 37 states. So if all that happened, that'd probably be a good thing. If it was ended up being a free-for-all at the convention and things were opened up and so many things were changed, it was reprehensible. I doubt that 37 states would ratify it. So that's my view on it.
Thanks, John, for the question. Thanks for coming this morning. I was in the committee that heard the resolution, and I supported it in committee. I've always supported it in the past as well. I just think that if you look at Washington, D.C., it's definitely not the model of good government. And in many ways, it's out of control. DC continues to attempt to gobble up more power from where it rightfully rests, which is with the states or with families or with individuals. And if you look at the federal budget and our national deficit, it continues to just spiral out of control. And it leaves us wondering, how does that all end? And as I look to those in Washington, I don't see the answer. But I do see the answer with the states. And so that's why I've supported this concept. I think that it can be limited, and so that we can send our delegates to the convention and they can focus on limiting government growth, on a balanced budget amendment, and on term limits for our people in Congress. And so I'm going to continue to support it, and I hope that we can get a little more traction when we bring it back over in the Senate.
From what I can understand, the House Joint Resolution 5001 is to apply for the Convention of States, which I was for, and now I'm kind of on the fence. I know that's kind of a cop-out, but I do understand the gentleman, Senator Johnson, I believe, has a different resolution for another approach to have term limits come up, and he's explained it to me. So that it doesn't necessarily put our Constitution at risk, but we can limit our federal government entities through the state actions. So like I said, I'm torn on this issue because I'm a Convention of States supporter all the way around. But with the current administration in, I don't know if our actions would be listened to. That's my fear. So I know that's kind of a cop-out answer, but that's where I sit.
Well, I've supported it as well and plan to continue to do that. I know it's not the cure-all to some of the issues that we face, but frankly, I think there's enough safeguards in place where things won't get out of control if we ever actually even get to that point where we can call one. But as I said, I've supported in the past, and if the opportunity comes up where I need to vote on it again, I will continue to.
Okay, great. Thank you. Do we have another question?
Could I just do a follow-up on that, just a quick?
Yeah, you go ahead.
You know, we implemented the 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution back in 1913. I was just double checking on the date of that. And that was when we changed from the legislature, the state legislatures choosing our US senators. We changed that to a popular vote. And that was probably the beginning of the problems developing in Washington, where we lost some control. And at this point, we have very little control over what happens in Washington. And that's just one of the things that led us down the wrong road, I think.
Okay, great. Thank you. We did have a pre-submitted question. And so the question was on SB 3, please explain the purpose of this legislation and your position on it.
Well, I think Representative Haugaard's looking it up, but SB 3, I think, is a law that was passed during veto day this past year. And it deals with the Department of Health's ability to basically go, I think, like arrest somebody if they've got COVID and, you know, they're just going and spitting on all the vegetables at the grocery store. And so we passed that law, we put a sunset on it, like we did all those COVID-related laws back in March of last year. Oh yeah, so and by the way, it adds COVID to the existing list of diseases that are already on this sort of law, like SARS, MERS, smallpox, other things. So I haven't really taken the time to fully consider how I'll vote for that. I'm sort of inclined to vote against it, just as a threshold matter. You know, we passed those laws with the idea that they would be limited in nature. I have not spoken with the Department of Health and found out how often that's been utilized, if it's been utilized at all. 10 times, I've been told, just now in the back. So 10 times. If there were a public health emergency declared under the law, you could actually declare a limited public health emergency and then go and arrest somebody like you would. And so even if we were to vote down this bill, I think that would still be available. But that's kind of what the bill is all about. And I haven't made any final considerations. I'm leaning towards voting no, or maybe just increasing the sunset period for a little bit longer. But that's sort of where I'm at on that right now.
This bill did come to the Senate and I did vote no on it. And the reason I voted no was because the COVID virus itself is in a category with the Ebola, SARS, and MERS. So I didn't think it warranted that type of categorization, you might say. I've been trying to catch COVID, and I don't mean to be flippant, but I've not been masking or whatever. The whole time. I've done the social distancing, but I still haven't got it. So if it were something like Ebola, you're betting your life I would not be anywhere near anybody with Ebola. So I voted no.
Well, if it makes it to the House floor, I guess at this point I'm inclined to support it. Maybe as Representative Hansen talked about, maybe we just extend the sunset. That might be a good option too. I would also note that it does also have in it that this does not compel a person to be vaccinated. So just to make that part clear. So these are unprecedented times that we're in. I, like everybody else, I hope they come to an end soon so we don't even have to deal with these sort of issues. But unfortunately, those are the times we're in.
Yeah, I would vote against removing the sunset, but the statute is already very broad. It indicates that if you're a person who has an active tuberculosis, this is the current law, tuberculosis, or this COVID-19 right now, SARS, MERS, viral hemorrhagic fevers, or any, it says, or any disease or condition which is the subject of a declared public health emergency. So it doesn't have to be in the list. And I think we might be arguing about something that's not all that important, but the statute, I think, was significantly modified just a few years ago, and we probably need to go back and revisit it because it is rather restrictive. And I'll just point out too that during the veto day, we had a whole bunch of bills came through. They made it through the Senate, and we killed most of those in the House. And those were to extend authority at the local level. And in that situation, I personally believe that there were adequate safeguards at the governor's level so that the governor could decide what was an emergent situation and use all the resources available to the state to make those ultimate decisions, as opposed to having 100 different decisions across the state. But when we killed those bills, the governor still, about 9 or 10 days later, issued an executive order that extended the authority of the Secretary of Health to do just about anything the Secretary wanted to do. Thankfully, the Secretary hasn't acted on all that or enforced all that, but that authority is already floating out there.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Adele Bowerly, and I just wanted to ask about Senate Bill 183. I wanted to know, it's 183? Okay, and my question was, why was this bill brought about, number one, and what contracts are you focusing on?
Okay, is that the abortion contract?
Yes.
Bill? Okay, sorry. There's a lot of numbers that fly around during legislative session, so sorry if I don't know, but if you know, okay, we're on the same page. So this is a bill that really was driven primarily by Senator Schoenbeck. He asked me to prime it in the House, and I agreed. And it came up in conversation related to surrogacy over the last legislative session. And I think there were a number of pro-life legislators in both the House and the Senate last year who were surprised to learn that in South Dakota, there are some contract provisions that in surrogacy agreements that call for a pregnant mother to abort a child if the intended parents ask the pregnant mother to. And in the surrogacy agreement, the contract provision would say, if the surrogate mother refuses to go ahead with the abortion because she just doesn't want to, then oftentimes she's placed with the burden of maybe paying back everything she's made under the agreement. She's responsible then for the care of the child because the contract is breached, and she's responsible for all the healthcare costs and everything moving forward. So I just think there was a lot of discomfort among pro-life legislators who don't like contract provisions in contracts which call for the abortion of children. And so this bill, Senate Bill 183, proposes to just prohibit those sorts of contract provisions from being included in contracts.
Well, first off, just as a caveat, we're over 450 bills that have been put in so far this session. Actually, we just kind of reached the deadline this week for individual legislators to introduce bills. So forgive us if we don't know all 450 of them inside and out, and it takes us a little while. Frankly, a lot of times, unless the bill's actually going to make it to a committee I'm on or on the floor that I'm on, it's just very difficult to stay up to speed on them all. But anyway, I just wanted to put throw that out there. So just looking at this, I certainly agree with Representative Hansen. Any attempts to coerce or compel an abortion, I would be against. So.
Yeah, the bill begins just adding, this is one of those things that's a deceptive act or practice, so it's a violation of law. And it adds it into the list. The whole issue of surrogacy really does need attention in the state of South Dakota. There was a case that was, I think maybe one of the few cases of surrogacy that was addressed through our courts. And it involved a woman here in South Dakota, out in the hills, who was going to carry a child for someone who contracted with her. That guy was from Florida, as far as we know, as a single man, contracted for her to carry this child. The egg donor was from Rhode Island, and the procedure was going to be performed in California. And so we need to have some kind of control over that situation, because you could have a pedophile in Florida. We have no idea who this guy was. Somebody like that could contract to have a baby born here and take the baby back to wherever he chooses. And there is no oversight or control of that sort of thing, and that's just unconscionable. So that's an example of what can happen and how vulnerable we are right now. You can email me and I can track it down.
This is really a question for anybody. HJR 5004, will you talk to us about what the purpose of that is, and if passed by the legislature, what will happen?
HJR 5004, the 60% vote threshold. Is that right, Mr. Hager? Okay, so see, there you go. There's another example. Those are two of my bills, which I'm not even sure of the bill number on, because there's just so many numbers flying around. I just have to double check if I don't have it in front of me. So HJR 5004 is a proposal to submit a question to we the people on the ballot to amend our Constitution. And what this would do, if passed, the question that will be submitted to the voters is to raise the vote threshold to 60% required for passage. If the measure is required to commit the state to spend $10 million or more in any given fiscal year for the first 5 years within the enactment, or if it proposes to raise a tax or a fee. And so where this kind of comes from is the people of the state, when we wrote the Constitution, we saw fit to put that same requirement on our legislature. Because if the legislature proposes to raise a tax, that's going to take an even larger threshold, a 2/3 threshold. If we're going to create a new spending program, that's going to also require a 2/3 vote. So the state of South Dakota has a history of holding ourselves to a higher vote threshold if we're going to grow government or raise people's taxes. And I think that's been really good for the people in the legislature. And so I'd like to put the question to the voters to see if we'd like to do the same thing, hold ourselves accountable, take a stand against higher taxes and big government growth. And frankly, I mean, we've got a lot of people right now, a lot of businesses, a lot of individuals, a lot of families who are considering coming to South Dakota. You know, you hear about it, but that is the real deal. I mean, if you've talked to a realtor over the last year, you'll find out there's people coming in from all over the country. It's astounding. And so I think we, the people of the state of South Dakota, can communicate to the rest of the country that we'll hold ourselves to a higher standard. If you come to South Dakota, we're not going to raise your taxes, and we're not going to do what Washington, D.C. does and balloon the government out of control. And so I think it could be a great measure for the people to vote on. And I would certainly hope that the legislature passes this resolution, allows the people to vote on this question.
Don, was that the question you actually had? HJR 5004 is really the one in regard to creation of a trust fund. Yeah, I would agree with what John had to say as far as the threshold. I think it's unfortunate that back in the 1890s, I think it was, we instituted an opportunity for people to have essentially a direct democracy without being able, it's like this marijuana bill. I think when you sit and talk to people for a few minutes and you tell them the ramifications of it, most people would say, no, gee, I didn't know all that. And so we've passed something like that just by a simple majority. Same with constitutional amendments that was instituted in what, 1990 or something like that. And, you know, the threshold should be quite high because you're talking about such significant issues that affect our lives. And unfortunately, in the public, you just don't have the opportunity to get all the information out there. So like this last election cycle, you know, we hear about some individual's particular situation with seizure disorder. And I think that commercial was very effective. And I know George Hendrickson, and I have all sorts of compassion for his child and his situation. But the voters responded to that with just a simple majority. And that's without vetting the issue thoroughly as it needed to be. So a high threshold for any vote to amend the Constitution or to pass a measure, an initiated measure, should be, I think for all of them, they should be at least 2/3.
And just quickly, I also agree with that. Changing the Constitution is huge and significant. I think a lot of times people think, well, if there's issues or problems with it, the legislature will just fix that. We can't just fix those things in the Constitution. It has to go back to a vote of the people. So frankly, that's kind of the mess we got in with the marijuana issue. And I'm going to guess that question's probably coming up down the list here soon. So I'll save it for that.
I do agree with this bill. So, and I agree with the gentleman up here that we needed to properly have our Constitution protected. So, thanks.
Thank you. And Marcia, one of our attendees here made mention to me that you didn't get an opportunity to respond on the abortion question. So I apologize. I didn't mean to cut you off. So if you want to. Okay. We do have someone here that would like to comment in regards to this discussion, though.
This is my wife, Amy, and I. We are what we call Michigan refugees. We moved here from Michigan to get away from that tyranny that is going on there, and it's just a mess. But we are grateful to be here in South Dakota, and your state is amazing, and we want to become part of the Dakota family, or South Dakota family. And we reside here in Brandon, so we appreciate it. We appreciate you guys and all that's going on.
We're very happy to have you here. Welcome to South Dakota.
I'm Nicole. I'm from Sioux Falls. I actually had a question because I know the Convention of States was coming back as a Senate joint resolution. And in listening to the one that was previously there, when it was brought up that this will open everything up to pretty much, I mean, in nicer words, destroy the Constitution. They can do whatever they want if we get the state convention. So I was actually just wondering because the Constitution is pretty clear. It's not supposed to be interpreted as, however you want it to be. So in the Constitution, where does it allow for things that aren't being brought up in the state convention to be brought up, I guess? Does that make sense? Like,
it makes some sense because it's not a tried and true measure as far as having a lot of track record. But there is a track record to it, and the founders did put it into the Constitution for a reason, so that there was an opportunity to address concerns that might have developed. And, some of these are just end up as cliches, but every day that Congress is in session, the Constitution is open to reconstruction or reinterpretation. Every day the Supreme Court convenes, the Constitution is certainly open to reevaluation. So, you look at what we've got going on here. This is insane, out of control spending. And even our own congressional delegation voted for these bills that put us another $4 trillion into debt. And there's just nobody tapping the brakes. And the idea of $1 trillion is $3,000 per man, woman, and child in the United States. And most people don't pay taxes. So if every fifth person is the one that's paying taxes, because you got kids that don't pay taxes, and you got lots of other folks that don't pay taxes. So if every fifth person is paying taxes, that means every $1 trillion worth of debt is another 15 grand for us taxpayers. And at this point, we're somewhere around $30 trillion in debt. That's $450,000 worth of federal debt per taxpayer. This is insane, and it can't continue. Now we've got discussions going on in Congress about an ongoing payment, just as an ongoing stimulus. These are ridiculous things. And like I say, our own congressional delegation voted some of those things through. And the first one kept us floating last year because we shut down just as much as everybody else shut down. That's kind of a fallacy that we were open for business, because we weren't. And you can ask restaurant owners and exercise club owners that went bankrupt. Were they shut down? Yes, they were. So, you know, the Convention of States thing is important. I don't know that's ever going to get enough traction to actually happen. And the idea is to get close to that with the hope that Congress then would respond and do the right thing. But there is such tremendous influence in Washington with lobbyists and special interests. It's rather discouraging.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand your question. And I think you're talking about maybe the ability of states to limit the delegates that they send. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, because it was brought up that if this passes, it's going to get to Washington, and then everything can be on the table, and they're just going to change everything. I can't remember who said it, but I guess I didn't see it that way, so it was new to me. So how, if the Convention of States happens, which, I mean, it's been going on for years and years, it probably won't, but if it happens, what allows everything to be opened up for conversation?
Okay.
I guess.
Okay, so I think you're right in identifying that the Constitution basically just sets forth the authority of the states, but doesn't really set forth the structure of what that looks like. And so one of the real fundamental debates on this topic is whether the states can limit the authority of their delegates. And so it's the premise of the proponents, and I share this view, that a state can send their delegates on limited authority. So in other words, here are the subjects that you can talk about, here are the subjects that you can propose, but anything beyond that, we're revoking your authority and you're coming home. And so some people who are hesitant on Convention of States are worried that we couldn't do that, and that way we'd have a runaway convention. I don't really share that view, but I think you're right to identify that it's not set forth in the Constitution and that we don't know for sure. But with the other protections in place, like state ratification of any amendment that comes out, that's a risk that I'm willing to take.
I kind of agree with John.
Hi, I'm Sherilyn, and I was wondering if you could give us an update on where we stand with the modifications of the birth certificates?
I believe that was killed in the Senate. It was brought through the House, as we've done in the past couple of years. We've gotten a number of things through the House, and the Senate is killing fields as far as what I view as pretty conservative issues. And, it deserved a hearing on the Senate floor, but it didn't get it. So I think that's the status right now.
We did have someone submit a question along that same line, and even though that bill was killed, the question is, if you could give your I guess, opinion on what the purpose is of our state legislatures continually trying to regulate a person's sex.
Okay, well, it's a fine question, even though I sort of disagree with the premise. Sex is regulated by science. It's the science of biology that tells us that sex is based upon your chromosomes, your endogenous hormonal profile, and your anatomy. That's what sex is. And so that's why I take issue with the premise of that question. You know, I'm not trying to regulate anybody's sex. I'm not trying to regulate how anybody lives along those lines. If somebody wants to, you know, live their life any way they want to, particularly as an adult, you know, have at it. But I think that when it comes to recording information on birth certificates, it should be factually accurate. And therefore, we have a sex designation on the birth certificate, and so that designation should list their sex as a matter of scientific fact. And that's why I supported the bill.
Well, I voted against the bill. The fact that it was defeated unanimously in committee and the Senate, I doubt that we'll see it again, but it's just hasn't been an issue that I've heard of. If it is, people aren't telling me about it. So I'm not quite sure why some of these things get brought forward when we've got plenty of other things to worry about. So.
Yeah, I would just point out that it is an issue in the state because there's different judges that have different opinions about whether or not that petition can be accepted and make a revision in the birth certificate. And the fact is, as Representative Hansen mentioned, the issue of one's sex is an immutable characteristic. What somebody chooses to call themselves, that's altogether different. And this bill wasn't about what do I want to call myself? How do I want to describe myself? It was to identify one's sex. And so that's why the bill is brought forward. And like I say, in part to give guidance to some of the South Dakota Circuit Court judges, because they're not uniform in what they're doing. So I think for the sake of the clarity of people going to court, asking for this to be addressed, it needed to be addressed in this bill. And unfortunately, it went by the wayside. As far as this issue coming up, you know, this reflects on the character of our nation as a whole, but specifically on the state. And we have people moving here because they think well of the state. You look at this Republican-dominated legislature, and you can't get conservative issues adequately addressed. So here we are with this, it's still a coin toss. You know, you go to private schools, I don't think they have too much of an issue with this. You go to public schools and all of a sudden it's an issue. And we're trying to straighten these things out, either through this or through the High School Activities Association, and you can't get them through because nobody wants to touch the issue because it's a hot button issue.
As a member of the Senate, I never did get this across my desk. It died in committee, but had it come, I would have voted for the birth certificate to remain male or female.
Yeah, just as a quick follow-up to that, you know, it's a disservice to girls and boys in competition in high school sports, especially to say that you can blur the lines. And it takes away the opportunity, especially for girls sports, takes away the opportunity for some girls sports to know with certainty that person was the one who excelled in girls sports. And I don't think there's been anything in South Dakota that's affected a championship type of thing, but there has been in adjoining states.
To follow up on that, in the Senate, I am supporting a bill brought on by Maggie Sutton that she's sponsoring and I'm co-sponsoring for specifically to keep female sports, and male sports, male sports. It just hasn't gotten out to you guys yet.
So I have another question in reference to the SB 141 as far as the background checks and the marijuana convictions coming off the record. Could you address any of that?
SB 141.
I believe
I'd be glad.
I believe this came out of the Senate from Senator Roll from Aberdeen, who is spearheading a lot of the marijuana issues for us. This one is basically if you had a conviction with a marijuana infraction, I guess, that since it's going to be made legal, that those convictions be removed from your record. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, I would be glad to address that too. That's essentially what it is. There's some details about if it's violation of, anyway, basically minor previous misdemeanor convictions or anything related to marijuana. But here's the problem, and this is what voters didn't understand. All the people sitting up at the penitentiary that are there on drug convictions probably have an underlying marijuana conviction. There's going to be probably an endless flood of habeas petitions of prisoners saying, well, if that wouldn't have been counted way back when, I wouldn't have been bumped up to here, and now I'm in the penitentiary. And those will have to be addressed. And that's just one of those things voters didn't know about. You know, I tried to get the information out as much as I could thankfully through the Brandon Valley Journal, but it's just one of those frustrations we're going to experience now for years because of this vote. And the idea of pulling these off the record, at the time it was an illegal act. It should be considered a black mark on your record. So I'm not real in favor of these things. This would clear up some of the background issues, but you know, we've chosen to make drug offenses something that's a ding on your record, and there was a purpose for that. At the time, you chose to violate the law. And I can tell you over the years, when I've had parents bring their kid in that was arrested for marijuana possession, and you ask those kids, where'd you get the drug? Well, I got it from Joe down the street. Okay, where do you think Joe got it? I don't know. Well, I can tell you that the drug cartels know where this stuff comes from, and it doesn't change. Colorado has an ongoing problem with the drug cartels with marijuana issues. So it's not going away anytime soon. It's just going to be like the flies coming into roost here. So we're going to have more activity with the drug cartels because they don't want to have their business plan interrupted. And this idea of removing it from your record, I guess, doesn't matter. It seems like we've kind of thrown the gates open on all these issues. And if we can't slow this down and get it under control, we're going to look like Colorado.
How will that look for the MVRs and other sort of reports that are run for various commercial businesses?
If this passed, it would simply take this, one of those things off the record potentially. But it's like when I go to court with someone and we get a suspended imposition of sentence, eventually there's a blank on that line on the clerk's computer. It doesn't show what actually the conviction was because it falls off after a period of time. So for employers, I think it's a disservice to employers because if you had that conviction on your record, well, you did something you knew was illegal. And I think if I were an employer in that situation, I'd want to know whether it's currently illegal or not.
I think we also have to be careful. A lot of cases where people end up plea bargaining and plead guilty to a much lesser offense when they maybe were charged with something much more severe. So let's say you were dealing marijuana and then they plea bargained it down to just a possession of marijuana to clear the case out. Do we want to wipe that off the record? I think we've got to be real careful about just having a blanket statute where you just, because you broke the law and it involved marijuana, your record is clear. So I'll approach this pretty cautious.
Yeah, I actually think those are all really good points that have been made. And it's not to say that I'm not for expungement in some circumstances. Expungement is when the charge of a crime is erased from your record. That's an appropriate thing in some situations. In fact, I think it's maybe a little underutilized. I think it maybe could be utilized a little more to encourage people to just like be clean, get treatment, be done with whatever it was you were doing. Maybe you're using something and move on with life. And if people are willing to do that, I'm willing to say, great. If you want to move on with life and put all that stuff behind you, I think as a society, we'd be willing to say, all right, after a certain amount of time, let's just take it off your record. You can have a clean record again. But this particular bill, I just think is too broad and maybe too soon, to be honest with you. I think those sorts of questions should be looked at on an individual basis. The courts are very good at these sorts of things, but to just do it on a broad category, I think is a little too much.
On the issue of the marijuana resolution or whatever it was that the voters voted on, I heard there was a lot of out-of-state money came in to promote that. Is there a way to limit that? You got a live stream. Okay, for the marijuana initiative in the state, and it was voted on by the people, and there was a lot of outside money that came in to promote that. Is there a way to limit, an issue that's affecting the state itself to donors who reside within the state?
It's a free speech issue, and that's the frustrating part of it. You can't really put those limits on, otherwise you'll step on our own toes at some point. So I agree with you, but like this last election cycle with the great ad that George Hendrickson did with his son, very compelling. And we didn't have our ducks in a row to respond to that and explain the other side of it. And we didn't have any leadership that stepped up with the ability to get the message out either. So here we are. We got caught with the voters not understanding the ramifications. Like I say, even the habeas petitions coming out of the penitentiary, or, the problems that Colorado's experiencing with increasing traffic fatalities solely based on marijuana use, the overdoses that they experienced within the first week of passage a few years ago when they first instituted that, all sorts of ramifications, but nobody considered those things, and it floated right on through.
From my understanding, South Dakota was outspent 10-1 for dollars on advertising for the marijuana passage. And what I feel is a disservice to our Constitution was what people didn't know when they voted for this, that they added 93 pages to our Constitution. And in that Constitution amendment, if you read it, and I have not, because the font is 3, and if you notice, I'm jumping between glasses here because I can't see very well. 3 font. This right here is like maybe 10, 11, what you normally read. So 93 pages of 3 font. Most voters did not read that. I guarantee it. And just so you're aware, we're talking about expungements. If your spouse and you get divorced and your spouse sits and smokes pot 7 times a day, and now you're going to court to do custody battles, in that 93 pages that you added to the Constitution, it says you cannot tell the judge that your spouse who's fighting for custody of your child, you cannot tell your spouse or the judge that your spouse sits and smokes pot 7 times a day. That is in the Constitution that people voted for.
Well, it's a good question. And I do think, to Representative Haugaard's point, you do run into freedom of speech issues. I tend to believe that if you're going to go out and knock on doors and hand out pamphlets, that's political speech. If you're going to stand up on the street corner, that's political speech. If you're going to donate to a candidate that you choose, also political speech. If you're going to donate to a ballot question committee that you support, also a form of political speech. And so what I've done in the past to try to address some of this is to attempt to make sure that those people who are out on the street corner circulating these petitions to get the measure on the ballot are South Dakota citizens. That's a law that we have existing. We've had it in South Dakota for a long time. And what I found in my practice and otherwise was that it was just being broken. People were being flown in from all over the country to circulate petitions to put measures on our ballot. So I at least want to make sure that it's a South Dakota process for South Dakotans and that it's South Dakotans asking the question, hey, should we change our law? Should we change our constitution? So I've worked pretty hard to make sure that we at least ensure the integrity of the process that way. And then, but the money side really is, it's a separate question entirely. And I'm loath to, trample on anybody's free speech rights.
I would just add a point too, that I wish we would expand the opportunity for the Attorney General's office to give a greater explanation of the ramifications as well. And it blurs into the area of maybe partisan politics and opinions, but the Attorney General is limited to, I think, 250 words in that statement of what the bill is really about. And how do you put, a 20, 30 page bill into 25 or 250 words? You can't do it. And that was the problem with this election cycle as well. There's bills out there suggesting that the entirety of the petition for change should be included on the ballot itself. In this case, it would have looked like the phone book, but that's what people should understand. You elect us to go out there and represent you because we can go through a committee process, hear the pros and cons, and that isn't even all that great sometimes because you might get imbalance in the information you receive. But at least there's a screen there where you can expect somebody to be discerning enough to kill the bad bills and let the good ones through. And I'll just point out, I've said this plenty of times before, the reason for public education as stated in our Constitution is to ensure the stability of our republic. So it says the stability of Republican form of government, depending upon the morality and intelligence of the people, it shall be the duty of the legislature to establish a standard and uniform system of education open to the public. Last part's a little bit of paraphrase, but the first part is correct, that you want a stable republic. The only way you can have a stable republic if you have moral and intelligent people. Well, who's going to decide the morality? The context of that morality was defined in our Constitution, I think, in large measure by the preamble, where it says, "In thanks to Almighty God, we hereby ordain this Constitution." Then laws that existed on the books in 1889 when the territory split, there were laws against blasphemy and Sabbath breaking. So there wasn't any doubt about what the context was. And the blasphemy is speaking words of contumelious contempt against God the Father, God the Holy Spirit, Jesus Christ, or the Holy Christian Scriptures. And so that's the context. We've drifted a long ways away from that. And if we don't find a place where we identify our sense of morality, then we'll continue to slide down this path of anything goes. So long answer to the question, but it's the free speech issue is really important, but there also needs to be an opportunity for the voters in these situations to have a better understanding what the pros and cons would be.
I'll just quickly share your concerns. We have to be careful. We have to allow the free speech and all of those things. But I think in this case, frankly, hats off to their marketing team because they did a wonderful job of selling this. I've heard from people that thought they had to vote for both of these measures, or the amendment and the measure, to get medical marijuana, and that wasn't the case. But did you know that we're the only state in the country that has approved both recreational and medical marijuana at the same time? Every other state has started with the medical and then transitioned into recreational. So we've got a huge challenge ahead of us to get this thing even close to implemented. And I frankly have got a lot of concerns with the recreational piece as evidenced in other states and talked about earlier. So and we're not going to go against the will of the people. I have not heard any of that discussion. We're going to work through this and get things in place as best we can. But there's going to be some challenges, and unfortunately, I think there's going to be some regrets to get us in this position that we're in.
Hi, I'm Jenny Bowe, and I'm just probably going to lump my two bills questions kind of together, if that's okay. So the first one is about House Bill 1248. It's the reporting for embryos. My question is, what issue is this addressing, and why are we bringing it up now?
Okay, thanks for the question. Great question. That's another one of my bills that I'm introducing this year. Basically, what that bill entails is that it just institutes reporting requirements is all that it does. So we have one in vitro fertilization clinic in South Dakota, and they create human life. It's an amazing technology. Along with that comes the destruction of human embryos. And so there's a beautiful creation. There's also a destruction that takes place. And so very similar to our abortion statutes, where we as a state have said, hey, we just have an interest in human life, generally speaking. The state has an interest in knowing, if in the abortion context, a human life has been terminated. And so I think the state has an interest in knowing with human embryos, which are, as a matter of scientific fact, a human being at its early stage of development, what's being created, what it's being used for, and if it's being destroyed. So it's simply just a reporting bill. The patient, I don't think, would ever know that this bill even exists. It wouldn't touch anybody's ability to actually go through the IVF process. It just allows the state to have the information so that we can make informed decisions about, what's happening with human embryos in South Dakota.
So I'm going to counter with that. So I am actually one of 6 families in the local area that is affected by infertility. So since there is only one medical facility that provides these services, numerous days, there's only one patient that's having these procedures formed. So really, how are you going to protect protected health information if you have to submit to the state the date these procedures were performed, what was done, what happened with it, what embryos left the state, how they were transported out of the state, and what information, if a surrogate or mother were to miscarry, the terms of that. I think that's extremely intrusive to families that are already fighting a lot. And what is the end goal? The original codified law that required research reporting specifically states this does not include IVF, because IVF, the entire purpose of IVF is to create embryo to life.
Yeah, and I agree with sort of your premise there that on an individual basis it'd be very intrusive, and the state doesn't need to know that. The bill only requires an annual report from any provider. And so just like we do in the abortion context, last year, unfortunately, I think we had about 400 to 500 abortions that took place in South Dakota. All of those were reported on an annual basis to the state with a lot of detail, actually, as far as age and location, those sorts of things. But it's all completely anonymized. Nobody knows who is going to Planned Parenthood to have the abortion. So it looked very similar to that. Nobody would be required to individually report anything. It would just be one provider that was required to report on an annual basis the total number.
Correct, but all of the individual pieces that are listed in that bill, which is more inclusive than the regulations on reporting for abortion, are to be made public in this bill, not just to be reported to the state. So how can you ensure someone's not outside that clinic, sees me go in to have that procedure done, the procedure date is listed, I'm the only patient that goes into that facility that day, it's public knowledge I had that procedure done.
Okay. Unless there's some confusion about the reading of the bill, I don't think any particular procedure date is required to be listed. If that's true in your reading, we can talk about that. I don't think the state needs to know that.
Okay.
Yeah, I really don't. That would be intrusive, and I agree it could violate somebody's privacy. Not what we want to do with this bill.
But you would feel comfortable stating that this bill is to gather future information that in the future could limit families' reproductive options.
Well, I don't think that that's the case either. There are some states, there are some whole countries like Germany, for instance, that limits the amount of embryos that can be created to the amount that are intended to be transferred, for instance. As far as I know, hasn't limited anybody's option in Germany to use the IVF process. I'm no expert on German IVF procedures, but there are also some clinics around the country who hold to a similar standard. And they're very successful clinics, and they've helped couples conceive countless numbers of babies. It's a beautiful thing. So this is basically asserting the state's interest in just knowing, we have to at least know if life is being created and if life is being destroyed. And I can tell you as a matter of fact, because I've been told this firsthand, that embryos are being destroyed in South Dakota. And so I just think it's important that to have an informed conversation, that those numbers are at least made known.
Informed conversation, I understand, but is there any mandatory reporting for couples not going through reproductive issues for when they're trying to get pregnant, when they miscarry, those situations where our families are being put in alternate requirements?
No, this is just about this is just about the
But you
creation.
stated that the state has a right to know when life is being created.
The state has a right, and by the way, this is a new interest, the state has long said, since I think the early 90s, that if you're going to destroy a human embryo, that in the case of research, it's prohibited, right? So the state also defines human being as being a human being at its earliest stage of development, including the human embryo. And so really the focus is on the destruction piece. How many embryos are destroyed in this process?
Okay, and in the bill it lists single cell. So do cancer patients that are undergo chemo, that do egg collection or semen analysis or collection before then, is this going to be used to skew the data for the time that those are in place?
No, this is just about the creation of the actual human embryo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question. Senate Bill 183, as likely and intended parents, it is the abortion
Yeah,
clause.
I'd just like to address this before we move on. This doesn't talk about single cell, this talks about embryos. And toward the end of it, or where?
In the beginning, right up top, it says at the smallest form, including single cell. Under the definition.
And that's currently in the statute.
Yes.
Yeah, that's not an amendment, that's currently in the statute.
Correct, but it changes it from research to in vitro fertilization. So
And
essentially
that's a
it's encompassing more.
Well, that's a definition section, that already exists. This new amendment, the new section, doesn't talk about single cells at all. So you might want to go back and see about amending the other section, but this bill solely addresses the embryos. And the point that Representative Hansen was making was the state does have an interest in human life, and we consider human life to exist at the point that you actually have the embryo. So, this is a year-end reporting. It's not a specific date-specific reporting for.
January 15th.
Yeah, it says by the end of or if it's January 15, but the totals are for the end of the year. So it covers the entire span of the year. It's not going to isolate one certain date when somebody went into a clinic.
You have to report on what specific dates procedures were performed, embryos were created, embryos were transferred out. It includes a lot of in-depth information.
No, it doesn't have the date at all. It just talks about the totals, the numbers.
Okay, I will follow up with Hansen afterwards
Yeah,
with my
you can
concerns
follow
with
up
the
on that.
wording.
But I just point out too that, if the state didn't have an interest in human life, then that would be one thing. But I can also tell you that it's important to know how many of these embryos are lost so that we can adequately reflect what's going on in the state. And I think the number, when we talk about 400 abortions per year, I think that's woefully low as far as the actual numbers that do take place. Because there's other procedures that take place in both Sanford and Navarra and probably Monument. that are DNCs and things that are essentially an abortion. And had we not chosen to go ahead with the acceptance of abortion back in the 1970s, there would be somewhere around 45,000 more South Dakotans, because that's how many abortions we've had in South Dakota. Back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Buck Williams out there at the abortion clinic was doing anywhere from 1,400 to 1,800 abortions per year. So we've lost all those South Dakotans. And when we talk about workforce, we killed the workforce. Had all those kids been born, grown up, and had families, we'd have 300,000-400,000 more people. So we have a very significant interest in life.
I don't want to cut anyone else off. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that earlier. Okay. So for Senate Bill 183, the contract bill, as intended parents that are pro-life, if we were to have a stipulation in our surrogacy contract that stated that termination of a pregnancy would only be allowed in a situation where the surrogate's life is at risk, would that be something that voids the entire surrogacy contract because it still technically refers to abortion?
Good question. We can sit down and look at the language. Really, so long as the pregnant mother is not, at least in section 2, so long as the pregnant mother is not sort of like saddled with more burdens under the contract, if she's not required to pay back the contract, then maybe not. But that's a great question, and I think that's something that we should consider.
So why the choice to void the entire contract instead of just voiding the part of the contract that addresses abortion?
Well, because basically because you need to have an adequate remedy that people will pay attention to, I think, and I think it's just really important for contracts not to include provisions that call for the death of a human being, and so that's why it's just a blanket prohibition on any contract that would include that provision. Also, I think it's a good protection because sometimes you look at these contracts, they're really long and complicated, and so you want to do what you can do to make sure that those provisions are just not put in, because sometimes people will put in contracts through contract provision that they know maybe aren't enforceable or aren't enforceable, but if you don't know this law, then you might not know that that contract provision might not be enforceable. And so people might be tempted to leave it in there. And so I just think it creates a really bright line, a clear rule that we're not going to allow for any contract that includes in any way this idea that one party can call for the termination of a human life through an abortion.
Okay. And then some clarification, you talked about these contracts not being enforceable. It was under my understanding that you could not require a woman to have an abortion, even if it was listed in contract, because in with Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, it does state that it's the woman's ultimate decision. She cannot be forced.
I agree with that. Under Roe and Casey, she cannot be forced. I think that's bad law, but I agree with under Roe and Casey that she can't be forced to have an abortion. And that's why particularly in the second section, it deals with not her being like, you have to go, I'm pointing a gun at you, you have to go, but it's saying if you don't go, then you're gonna have to pay back everything you've made under this contract. You're gonna now assume custody and care of this child, etc. So it's not an explicit, none of these agreements purport to force anybody. They're just coercive in that if you don't get that abortion, you're going to have to pay back everything you've earned under this contract. You're going to have to figure out the custody of this child, and you might even be penalized in other ways.
But that wouldn't be the case because it wouldn't void your contract and it's unenforceable. She can't be forced. And as long as that contract's still in place, the custody is still insured. But we can always discuss that more afterwards. But then I did want to ask you a little bit. You had shared with Mitch Rave from Sanford that you were not going to bring an anti-surrogacy bill this year. What changed your mind?
I don't see this as, well, he asked me if I was going to bring a ban on surrogacy, to be clear, I think, if I remember that conversation. And I didn't. This bill is a pro-life bill that deals with abortions that are called for in contracts. And frankly, it's a bill that is being led by Senator Schoenberg, and he just asked me to help him out on the House side. So I agreed to prime sponsor it over there.
Okay. And so you had shared last year that you received a lot of pushback from your constituents in regard to the Sorcy bill. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, we
Okay.
had conversations last year.
So I have a question, being vice president of Right to Life, if there comes a situation where your constituents are on an opposing side of Right to Life, how will you vote?
Oh, well, I don't vote based on my position on South Dakota Right to Life. And frankly, I have disagreements with constituents all the time. What I do is when I campaign, I tell you where I'm at. I tell you what I believe. It's on my website. We can have a conversation about it on your front doorstep. And I'll always tell you, I'll always be honest about where I'm at on the issues. And I just go out, I vote my principles, I vote my conscience.
Okay, so Dale Bircher shared with our agency last year that Right to Life helps to fund and aid in funding of campaigns for those that will bring bills for Right to Life specifically. Can you share if these bills were brought for those reasons, please?
Well, Right to Life is a nonprofit organization, so they don't do that actually, but there is a political action committee that's associated with some of the people on Right to Life. And they do assist in campaigns, but honestly, the political action committee side, you can look up the campaign report online. It's not very active. It's just, I think maybe there was one instance where somebody donated money last year because they wanted to help out a candidate through Right to Life. And so Right to Life helped them out. But I don't know if that's answering your question, but South Dakota Right to Life, PAC, Political Action Committee, not very active. And I would take issue at any insinuation that any member of the legislature is bringing bills because they've received a campaign contribution. I think every single member of our legislature takes an oath, and they are very loyal to their oath. That's part of the oath. We don't exchange valuable things for our votes. And if they do, it's absolutely wrong. It's a violation of their oath, and they ought to be called out for it. But if you can, show a specific instance, please. But I don't think that happens.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your questions. I certainly don't mean to cut off this conversation. We just have others with some additional questions.
So Doug, what would be, when it comes to this, and Bill SB 187 establishing criteria regarding marijuana, I've not read that bill, but I mean, what are the things that you're looking for in criteria to regulate the recreational use of marijuana? Like, what are the things that you would say we got, because you said, the will of the people, we're respecting that. What are the things that you would say, just from a law enforcement, legislative perspective, what are the things that we need to put in place to protect the people of South Dakota from the people of South Dakota and their will?
I'll answer that briefly.
Okay, sure.
Or were you directing your
No,
question?
Well, yeah, I was directing to Doug, but I
Oh,
thought.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Doug.
Well, first off, 187 is basically a vehicle bill. There's several of those out there. So that way we can get ahead of the filing deadline, and it's put in place as we work towards maybe getting some things sorted out with the marijuana issue. That's kind of what this is for, so we can add to it as we go along, just as a side note. But frankly, in the 10 minutes we have remaining, I don't think I could list all of the issues that we have to get this to implementation, but just things like where can you sell it? Who's going to grow it? Who's going to, what kind of quality control is there going to be? I might buy an edible from one store that has a THC content of 20%, and I know that I can take 2 or 3 of those at a time or whatever. And I might go to another store where it's 55%. And if I take 2 or 3 of those, I'm going to be overdosed and face medical issues. So where can you have it? Can you smoke medical marijuana, or can you just take it in a pill form or an oil form? We've got a bill that's up in judiciary about, can you smoke marijuana in a car? Should we treat it like an open container? That's kind of what the bill is that's being proposed. I mean, because the voters have basically said that marijuana is on the same level as alcohol to a certain extent. So along those lines, we don't allow you to have a drink while you're driving your car. So you probably shouldn't be able to smoke marijuana while you're in your car either. But then there were some concerns whether or not, if it's in pill form, is that okay to have that in your possession in the car? You know, what if it's locked in the trunk? I mean, there's so many things that we have and a lot of things that are currently addressed in statute that we have to go in and change and fix because they may involve marijuana as a drug, and now all of a sudden it's not illegal. So those things need to be repealed and removed. It's just, you know, it was stated earlier, there's over 90 sections to that initiated measure. It literally takes an hour or two just to read it, let alone comprehend it and decide whether or not that's something that we need to address legislatively. I've talked with law enforcement already, and they have tons of concerns and questions about how do we enforce this piece or that piece, and how do we address it? And I mean, kind of a long answer to your question, but yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done. Now, again, as I said earlier, our will is not to just wipe this thing clean, because it was pretty obvious, at least with the medical piece, that 70% of the people wanted it. So we're going to do what we can to implement it, but we're going to do it cautiously and make sure that we have things in the right place. So people aren't later saying, geez, what a disaster. Why didn't they fix this before they opened up the gate? So that being said, this might not get implemented as quickly as people want, but should not be an indication that we're dragging our feet and trying to resist it. So we'll get there eventually.
Yeah, as Doug said, this is just a vehicle bill that gives an opportunity to raise any issue associated with marijuana. But I can tell you too, in visiting with the director of the DCI, they expect a significant increase in all drug traffic in South Dakota because of this, because that's the experience in other states. So they'll probably be adding staff. They expect to see more seizures of drugs and money and guns. It's just going to go up.
Yeah, I think undoubtedly, John, there's going to be areas that need attention. One that Representative Barthel mentioned was, for example, if you're operating a vehicle, probably shouldn't be smoking or ingesting marijuana at the time. That's not in any of the laws that were passed. So those sorts of things we have to deal with. And even on IM-26, the medical side, if you read the last section of that measure, it calls for marijuana to basically shall be prescribed to kids in school. And I don't know if a lot of people knew that that's what they were voting on, but that's in the bill. And so, I just imagine, what does that look like? I mean, somebody's got to make that decision. What does that look like? I mean, are we going to have the school nurse passing a joint to the ninth grader, and then they go wherever back behind the school and smoke it up? I mean, so there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed and answered. It's a massive question that really is going to take more than one legislative session to sort all this out.
I went to it was called Marijuana 201, which was a meeting basically to learn about the production side of marijuana. And in that 93 pages, which the voters didn't read, it says that you, the general public, cannot have a pot plant. I bet they didn't know that. And what I'm understanding is the whole point of legalizing marijuana was to cash in on the drugs, get some tax revenue from it. And it's going to be so good for the farmers and this and that. And then we'll set up distribution centers. From what I learned in that informational meeting, which set my temper a little bit too high, I was so mad at every person that voted for it because they did not know what they just did. The consultants that we're meeting with have, they say that they're not involved, or they're just being informative. They're talking, they have it from, their beautiful, just, what am I trying to say, John? They're not their display, but their program, their videos that they're showing, and they're showing the beautiful facilities of which they come out of, they're watching it from seed to sale and the distributorships or whatever. We do not know what mess we just got ourselves into. And for that, I'm so sad. And I don't know how we're going to fix it.
Well, hopefully we can squeeze in one more question here before the end of the coffee. Let's talk about money. There's a lot of CARES money out there this year, and the governor proposed $100 million for broadband. And she also proposed a $50 million trust fund where you could only spend the ongoing, the interest for ongoing purposes of state government. What's your perspectives on that? Do you support it? Does it need to be tweaked? I know Representative Haugaard, you're on appropriations, but I'd like to hear from all four of you on that.
Well, I can start. Well, I've heard the comment made that things are a lot easier when we don't have money to fight over. So it's a good problem and it's a bad problem in many ways. But frankly, they're real dollars we're talking about. I mean, we're literally talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that we have. And there isn't a lack of people and ideas and ways to spend it. So we're going to look at it closely as we go through this. I mean, I certainly support a lot of the concepts like the expansion of broadband and perhaps maybe having a trust fund might be a good use of it. But as I said, I mean, most of them that I've looked at are all very good ideas, but I think there's way more ideas and dollar amounts than there is dollars to be had. So, it wasn't that long ago, we fought over $1 million just for pheasant habitat that took us till 3 or 4 in the morning. And now we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's going to be its own problem in and of itself, but it's a good problem to have, but there are other states, frankly, that are in the opposite position. So because of the way that our state approached this whole pandemic and because of the economy in our state is doing much better than others and people have stepped up to the plate, we're in this position. So as I said, it's a good problem to have.
Well, we could have balanced our budget without this infusion of money, but it's here and there's this inclination to spend it, which I think is absolutely wrong. It's federal debt. I don't think just because the other states are doing it, we should do it. And I've had this argument with a number of people who say, well, if we don't spend it, it goes back to the pool and somehow it gets distributed to other states. Well, what do you tell your kids? Just because other people are doing it doesn't mean you should. And I think we ought to try to apply some of that responsible leadership in our state, but I suspect we're going to be steamrolled and it's going to get spent. And $100 million for broadband, tell me how you come up with a round number of $100 million. The fact is, what I see from FCC reports is it indicates that only 3.8% of the state population does not have a cable to its house. Whether they hook up to it or not, but it's available to all but 3.8% of the state's population. And the rest of the state, they can hook up to HughesNet, Viasat, this Elon Musk new organization. There's all sorts of options available, or they can use their cell phone as a hotspot. For the state to come in and start paying for this stuff, when did that become a responsibility of state government? And I know there's arguments that the REA had some funding authority back in the 1930s, 40s. I get that, but that doesn't change any responsibility of the state or federal government in regard to getting a cable access to your house. If you choose to live out in the middle of nowhere and you can't get access, well, that's your choice. So my view is we ought to be very prudent about it. And just because the money's there doesn't mean you should suck it up and use it. And we talked about the trust fund. If you can set these funds aside, that would be wiser than just to spend them all of a sudden on things that are not our duty. And in fact, with the broadband issue, you only have a handful of larger providers in the state. And what's happened is they've picked one of those as the one they're going to criticize. So how is this money going to get distributed? All of a sudden, we're going to take millions and millions of dollars and send checks out to these organizations? Well, they've been laying this cable for years. Are we going to reimburse them for that? There's already federal programs that accommodate some of that. So I think we ought to be responsible and lead the nation like we always talk about with being, out there in front leading the nation. I think we ought to lead the nation and do the responsible things with this money and not just spend it because it's accessible.
Yeah, so I've never been in a race to spend all the money. That's not where I come from. I think the money that we spend ought to be well thought out. It should be prudent expenditures, and if we don't agree on it, then we should save it until we decide in the future that we have a worthy cause and we should spend the money on something that's really important to the state. So we've got a lot of money that's just basically sitting there as one-time funds right now. I think we ought to just slow down a little bit, make sure that we're very careful as far as what we're spending on, make sure it's the right priority for South Dakota before we spend any of that money. And if it just goes to savings for a while, I think that's fine. I think that'd be just fine. As far as the broadband goes, I definitely want to see more information on that. Representative Haugaard just mentioned this statistic of 3.8% of households that don't have a cable that's already running to the house. Right, but they would have satellite access, and that's something that's compelling to me too. There are new technologies like SpaceX, Starlink, internet, super fast broadband internet. I've seen some really impressive demonstrations of that technology, and so I don't want to go ahead and lay all this line and expend all this money on a technology that might not be the right way to go 10 years or 20 years into the future. So I've not made any real final decisions on that, but I just want to see more information before we go expending that sort of amount of money on any particular piece of technology, with technology evolving so quickly.
I agree with all the representatives. The penny pincher in me wants to figure out how many households we would actually be servicing to invest $100 million in. I think if we did the math, we would come out and we'd be like, we're giving them how much money to run wire to your house? It's insane to me. And I agree with John that we should be watching how we're spending, and if we don't need to spend it, let's put it somewhere else and tie it up for a while. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for all of your questions. I want to again extend a thank you to our District 10 and 25 legislators. Thank you, all of you, for coming. I'd also like to give a big thank you to Dave at Tailgaters for hosting our event here. We really appreciate them. And I'd also like to give a big thank you to Steve Tripp at McKinney Olson. He sponsored our muffins and donuts and coffee this morning.